What is up, Maniacs? We had a good week too. We had a very good week too. Turned 2 grand into 18 grand. Took down first place in the NFL 75K screen pass tournament. Won 10 grand there. And then it finished 19th place in the Millie Maker. We had a legit shot at the Millie last week. It was exciting. It was fun. I had 3 guys in the overtime game between the Giants and the Cowboys. Really wanted one of those 3 guys to score the game-winning touchdown. That would have really moved us up the ranks, especially if it was Pickens. If he would have got that, if he would have had like a big play and got that 100K bonus on top, or even Ferguson actually getting the 22-yard touchdown catch would have got us a lot of points. But we had a big week. A lot of fun. We're going to walk through the construction of these different lineups, as well as just kind of the overall breakdown of the bankroll management throughout the week. Obviously, when you have big weeks like this, when you bank one like this, it helps the bankroll quite a bit. But one of the biggest takeaways from this week that we've talked about throughout all of my videos is the importance of stacking, the importance of really pursuing games rather than players. And we can see that here. Basically, this lineup is pretty much built between 2 games. We have, obviously, the Lions were the team that you needed to follow last week, but we had Goff, Gibbs, Amon-Ra on the Lions in that game, and then we had the comeback with Rome Odunze there, which was the one and only comeback you could have in that game. We just happened to have the right one. I liked Odunze's price better than any of the other Bears going into the day, so I had a ton of Odunze across the field. It worked in our favor. The Malik George Pickens stack I had even in a ton of non-Dak stacks. I didn't make the leap and jump over to Russell Wilson. I didn't see that explosion coming, but I had a ton of Dak lineups that we'll break down as well. Just important to see our philosophy working, right? Like, we're gonna have some weeks where we miss the games, but we're picking games more than we're picking players. And then when we choose those games, we're choosing as many combinations from those games as we can. Obviously, Gibbs wasn't the running back that I needed to have, but he did enough to get us into that top echelon and to take down some of the smaller tournaments. I only put this lineup into 2 tournaments. It had 7 to be the Millie Maker and the tournament that I won for the 10K, the $15 entry there. Obviously, in hindsight, would love to have this lineup in as many tournaments as possible. But the Bears Lions game was actually like my 3rd or 4th favorite game of the week. So I didn't have Goff wasn't like one of my primary plays. I had roughly probably 10 to 15 Goff lineups. He's a guy that I'm going to be playing every single week. If we go back and we look at previous weeks, let me get the correlation chart pulled up here. So this was last year, but if we go back and we look at his playoff run was crazy, his fantasy playoffs. So week 14, here it is. He was QB6 this week, brought Tim Patrick and Sam Laporte along with him, but week 15 is where it really gets going. Here we got Goff, Gibbs, Amon-Ra, Sam Laporte, similar to what we had yesterday. Then we had Goff, Gibbs, JMO, and Laporta. It's different combinations. We saw a lot of that last year. So Goff, when he goes off, he brings guys with him. So that's why he's going to be in my lineup, in my player pool every single week. Because despite matchups, if he goes off, he's going to bring guys along with him. Then it's a matter of just mixing and matching those combinations to hopefully getting the correct combination. I actually could have and should have had, instead of Pickens down here, the best stack from this game would have been Neighbors and Ferguson, or actually Neighbors and Javonte Williams. If I could have put Javonte Williams in hitter instead of ETN. And then down here had JMO instead of Pickens, that actually would have jumped me into 2nd place in the Millie Maker. So we were close. We were close to having the right combinations, but we're we're on the right track as far as the philosophy of attacking games. I attacked 2 games primarily in this lineup, and those happen to be the 2 games that went off with the Lions and Bears and the Cowboys and Giants. Let's go and let's just look at the breakdown of our profit from last week and the breakdown of tournaments. And head-to-head, I did roughly $600 in head-to-head. I was right on the money line, so I did a bunch of double ups, and so I just barely just won a few of those. I was right on it. My big miss, if we go back to contests over here, my big miss is I went hard on, let's see, let's find a double up here. I went hard on Justin Fields. I was high on the Jets. That was my big miss on the week. So Fields killed me. He was the quarterback, the cash quarterback that I was very confident in, that the rest of the market was saying that it didn't make sense to have him there. I just thought his floor was very low with the rushing, and I was wrong. I thought the Bills' defense was bad. I think what this actually is showing us more than anything is I think it might be the Steelers' defense that is bad, because they had a rough week against the Jets, and they had a rough week against the Seahawks yesterday as well. So missed bad on Fields. McCaffrey was somebody you had to play. This is just a smaller tournament that I pulled up here, but he was somewhere around like 70% owned in most cash lineups and most like bigger field cash tournaments. Chase Brown was another guy that was in that same range. So these 2 guys were like guys that you just eat the chalk. If these guys don't play well or they do play well, it doesn't really matter if the majority of the field has them. What it comes down to is like your lower owned guys. If they have the weeks that you need, that's really the difference in cash. You're trying to pretty much just limit it down to a few spots by just eating that chalk, as long as you feel confident in that chalk. But what I missed is the guys that I was going contrary to the field was Breece Hall and Justin Fields, and the devastating thing I did killed me. I could have even got past that in cash this week if I would have chosen Odunze, which is what I had in here until about 10 minutes before kickoff, and then I put in Olave just because everything I was looking at the projection models was that he would have a higher percentage, and he had 12 targets last week. Wasn't too scared of the matchup. Figured he would. He did kind of what I thought. He had the floor here, but I really wish I would have put Odunze in there. So we did not have a profitable cash week, but that's okay. We just missed bad on our Justin Fields. And we looked at, let me pull up week 2 prep. So if we go back and we look at the Jets, like this is why our grades aren't the only thing, because they were by far had the best matchup advantage of anybody. And this, as the weeks go on, the season goes on, these numbers are going to be more reflective of the actual skills of the players as far as their grades. The first week, if the Jets seem to have had a very positive matchup against the Steelers, which coming into the year we didn't think was going to be an easy defense to score points against, but the first 2 weeks is actually proving differently. So and then also the Bills played the Ravens, which the Ravens are an absolute juggernaut on offense. So, of course, they're going to have, look bad on their defensive stats, which is why we have this big gap that we saw in the Jets. So these grades can be helpful, but they're not the end-all, be-all. So I do like to look at these where we perceive matchup advantages based on the grades from week to week, but it's not the end-all, be-all. So lesson learned there. I was too heavy on the Jets. I had Breece Hall in probably 60% of my lineups. So if I wouldn't have had one strong lineup like I did, it would have been a tough week for me. But thankfully, this was not the only game that we were heavy on. I was very heavy on the Cowboys-Giants game and very heavy on the Lions and Bears game. So let's go back over here to our profit. We did not. Our 3x multiplier entries, we got one of them banked. That was a Joe Burrow lineup, so it wasn't bad, but when your quarterback goes down in the first half, if Burrow would have stayed healthy, which is obviously we don't have control over, but we can't be building lineups expecting somebody to get hurt halfway through the week. So like the philosophy was correct here. If Burrow was healthy, we would have 3x'd that $157 there. We did hit our quintuple up lineup. I'll pull that lineup up over here. You can check it out. Let's go to contest. Let's see. Find a quintuple up. Here we go. So this was a Dak Prescott lineup. You can see I missed bad with Breece Hall. But what I'm doing in a lot of these multipliers is I'm betting on an offense. So I don't need every single one of these guys to go off. Like obviously I was closer on having the correct Dallas stack in here. With the correct Dallas stack, if we go over here and we look at DFS week 2, like the best stack would have been Dak, Javonte, and Jake Ferguson. CD had a decent day, but not big enough at his price point. And Pickens, who is probably my highest rostered receiver, had an okay day, but not the boom we're looking for. Middle of the pack here. Obviously, there's some guys up here that were better values, but we don't need to be exactly right when we're doing these multipliers or these smaller field tournaments. That's where we mix these in because it can give us that enough bankroll to continue chasing that milli like we were last week. And when we banked the big one, it feels really good. So primarily you can see like I missed on a lot of guys here, but my core stack, Dak, CD, and Pickens and Javonte with the comeback of Malik Neighbors, that right there was enough points to get me in the money on this quintuple up. Missed bad on Hunter. Fanner was fine. And then Breece Hall was a bad miss. But yeah, that it just goes to show you like when you're building out these multipliers, you can overstack it. And if you're right on the QB and you're right on the offense, if you're right on 2 out of the 3 or 2 out of the 4 even, but they're the ones that hit the big games, it can be enough points to move you along. And even like though CeeDee Lamb didn't have a huge game, he still had a big enough game. Like when you're scoring 40 points, your guys are going to score plenty of fantasy points, enough to get you into the money on these multipliers. So that's why I like playing these, is because I pick 4 or 5 different offenses and I spread that across my triple ups, my quintuple ups, and my 10x lineups. And if I'm right on one of those quarterbacks that I have spread across there, then we're going to break even or even do better on the week. So if I wouldn't have had the big, large field bank that I had this week, this would have done a pretty good job of maintaining my bankroll from last week. 10x, we did 10x a $2 lineup, but we were close on the 10x entry. Actually, the 10x entry, now I think about it, I accidentally put one of my 5x entries into the 10x. That's the one that banked. This one I think let's look at it. I remember it was comically bad. Let's see. We'll just, for a 10x. Oop. Too many double ups in here. Triple up. There we go. No, yeah. I was heavy on the Jets game in this one. Went Jets-Bills game without having James Cook, which was the big miss of my day. If I could have been heavy on James Cook and not Breece Hall, it would have been a really big day. But yeah, a lot of ice cubes here. Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson were a couple of my core plays that missed hard. Had Malik though, so it wasn't horrific. But yeah, this lineup in hindsight looks really bad. But again, this is why we're betting on games. You're not going to get every game right, but when we get 2 or 3 of our games right, we're going to have plenty of lineups that have the solid combinations in them. All right, let's and then I didn't really play any smaller GPP tournaments last week for whatever reason. Kind of was scrambling to get all my lineups in with just a crazy week with some family stuff. Had a death in the family, so that kind of threw off my regular process this week. But when we got into large fields, we turned $928 into 16,749. That's a pretty big week. So we are definitely profitable on the year so far with the nice bank in week 2. Pretty much got a free roll for the rest of the year. Hopefully we can keep adding to this, and when we get week 18, we can cash it out and have a solid season in DFS. All right, I did want to pull up, just kind of look at this week's results. So we have the salary, their fantasy points. Also in here, I have hidden their draft percentage. So we can see the top 3 guys were very low owned last week. And it's interesting too, a lot of people would not assume that Bryce Young was top 3 quarterback last week because they were trailing the whole game. But in the comeback, which Bryce Young is going to be in a decent amount of, and he seems to have a knack for bringing them back into at least being competitive. Their O-line is just so bad. I think he's a pretty good quarterback, actually. I think he's honestly probably top 15-ish if he had more support around him, but he does not. All right. What did I do there? There we go. We don't want that. We'll hide this column. Well, I have here is I have teammates highlighted primarily out of the top 5. So Goff was the guy you needed to have. He was the guy I had in my lineup. Amon-Ra St. Brown was the wide receiver you needed to have. One thing I wanted to point out here too, I've talked about it in the past. Jamar Chase had a huge week at 40 points. He was 8,100, but you did not have to have him. What I've said in the past is there was only 1 week in last season in 2024 in which a high-priced wide receiver, a wide receiver above 7K, had a week big enough that you had to have them, and they weren't attached to their quarterback. Their quarterback wasn't top 5. That only happened 1 time all season last year. So the reason I point that out is the lineup that I had banked, that had the big lineup, I had the top 2 I also had game correlation with Malik. Even though I didn't play Russell, I was playing game correlation of the Cowboys in that one. I didn't have Jamar in it, and that wasn't the miss. I didn't have to have Jamar. I had plenty of Jamar lineups, but they were all with Joe Burrow or with Trevor Lawrence lineups where I was doing game stacks with the Bengals and the Jaguars. But I think it's very important to see that. Like, everybody's going to see, oh, wow, Jamar Chase had a big week, and we'll look at his ownership percentage here. Yeah, of this group, he was the highest owned, but you didn't have to have him. The guys that you had to have were obviously the top 2 and Amon-Ra and Malik, or a combination of 2 of these 3. You needed 2 of these 3. Didn't really make sense. Jamar was the one that you didn't really see in many of the top end lineups that were at the very top of the Millie Maker, because the game correlation didn't play out, even though it was a high scoring game in the Bengals and Jags game. There wasn't great scoring as far as fantasy points that were concentrated. It was very spread out, and on the other side, the highest scorer on the Jaguars was where is he over here in the running backs? Travis Etienne, right? He finished as top 12 or top 13, running back 13. So that was decent, but the only stack out of the game that would do anything for you was Etienne and Chase, and it wasn't good enough to do anything. So there were very few lineups that made sense that were going to have Chase in it that got to the finish line. Having these 3, basically you wouldn't have had enough salary to do anything else if you had those 3. But these 3, which are the 3 we had with Amon-Ra, Malik, and Roma Dunze, that would have got us across the finish line. And then, that's really what carried ours across the finish line, was that game stack between Amon-Ra and Roma Dunze. And then Malik and Jake Ferguson and George Pickens was our other stack that we had in the big lineup that basically won us 16K. Wish I would have mixed in a little bit of Wandale. I just wasn't on the Giants. Russ looked bad in week 1, but again, this is why we don't overreact to 1 week. The matchup was much better for Russ this week, and they did a better job of throwing the deep ball. Wandale's a guy that if I were building Russell Wilson lineups, I would have got to because he gets so much volume. I want to add pieces to Russ. If I'm saying Russ is QB1, then obviously Malik is going to be the most likely one, but obviously 0.64% of people had Wandale. He would have been one that made sense to tack on. If you guys going to be QB1 or 2, more than likely they're bringing 2 guys with them, especially in like a shootout type game like that one was. So it's just important to notice when we go to future weeks. One thing, I was on Jonathan Taylor, but I wasn't on him enough. I was also on Cook, but I wasn't on him enough. Kind of frustrated that I didn't mix him in. I got too heavy on Breece Hall. I really felt like it was going to be a great matchup for him. He looked really good last week. I'm not going to go away from Breece Hall throughout the year. I will continue to build Jets stacks. I think they just seem to lose confidence early in the game, and they couldn't get anything going. But I think in games where they get confidence going, they'll have some boom weeks here and there. But I shouldn't have dedicated as many lineups and percentages as I did to Breece Hall. I just overreacted a little bit to the grades, which I tried to make sure that I'm keeping a level head on that stuff, but I did not do that in this case. Guys that were, solid quarterbacks that added up. Javonte was like the running back that made the most sense from a stacking standpoint. Everybody had McCaffrey. I had a ton of McCaffrey as well. His price has jumped up to $8,500 this next week, so we aren't getting cheap McCaffrey anymore. He didn't have a boom week, but he didn't hurt you either. Javonte was a guy, basically I missed on. I had some of these guys, but I didn't have enough of them. Achane, I just didn't believe in Miami's offense. But one of my big takeaways from this week is we're always going to be playing players against Miami. You can see a couple guys in here in the top 10, Drake May and Ramondre. And I think, if you have a team with like more explosive weapons, they'll be just a smash button against Miami. But I also kind of think the same thing for New England. I'm thinking New England's defense is still a ways away from being good, despite having Vrabel there. They just don't have enough talent there to be a good defense. So we will be targeting New England moving forward with whoever they play, their offenses. But Devon Achane, he can get there ugly, and I know that. I just didn't feel like he had a chance to be top 3 last week, even though he was. Taylor had a tough matchup, but he's always done well against the Broncos, and I said that in the week 2 lead up, if you're watching that at all. But I didn't play him enough despite saying that. And Cook, I was all over that game. I just didn't have enough of him. I think I had somewhere around like 10% of him. Obviously would have loved to swap him and Taylor into my lineup, or him and Javonte. Javonte is the one that would have made the most sense in my Goff lineup that had the other game stack of Malik and George Pickens in it. But I think it's important to see that this is every week is when an offense goes off, especially if it's a pocket passer like Jared Goff, and Russell Wilson he runs a little bit, but he's primarily a pocket passer as well. They're going to bring people along with them. So we're making bets on offenses. If we think Goff can be QB1, what are the different combinations of players that come along with him? Same with Russ Wilson. We can see that if we had that philosophy and we messed around with different combinations, we had the possibility of having a really good lineup like we did, because we bet on offenses and we tried to just mix and match combinations rather than trying to get in the nitty gritty of figuring out who has this perfect matchup, who's this individual player that's going to go off. That's basically impossible to predict. There's so much nuance in every single week. But what happens in a lot of weeks is 1 or 2 or 3 offenses, they have outlier outcomes. And if we chase that outlier outcome for offenses, then we're going to get outlier outcomes for individual fantasy players. Then it's just a matter of mixing up our combinations and getting the appropriate one. It's going to bink us that milli. So that's a philosophy I take in and week out, especially in the larger tournament fields, is chasing those outlier outcomes for offenses, and it served us well this past week. Another thing of interest, when we look at tight end, we look at percentages. Trey McBride, expensive tight end. This is where you get a lot of people, the casuals that are playing. They see Trey McBride, they know he's good at tight end. For Trey McBride to pay off, he has to be tight end 1 and tight end 1 by a mile. he was not a good play this week, despite being tight end 3, because Jake Ferguson was tight end 1 at 3,800. Juwan Johnson was tight end 2 at 3,600. Even if McBride was tight end 1, but he was only tight end 1, like if you swap their points, if you swap Ferguson and McBride's points, and you put Ferguson down at 13 and McBride at 16, Ferguson was still the better play because you saved $2,200 in salary. Primarily at tight end, you want to, for the most part, you want to punt. Like, it's very rare for an elite tight end to go off enough that you have to have them. So for the most part, I'm going to be hovering under 4,500. Tyler Warren this coming week is 4,400. I'm going to be all over that, but then I'm going to be primarily in this cheaper range. 38, 36, 31, 45, 2,500. Those are your top 6 tight ends right there outside of the 6,000. So lesson to take away from that, and we see that week in and week out. I'll be breaking this down each week and be putting some data together throughout the whole year through this charting. But that's one of the biggest takeaways that I saw from this season and tracking from last season as well. Running back, another important thing to talk about here. It's about volume. It's about you want to go after guys that, despite the matchup, are good players, have boom upside, and are getting a lot of volume. Jonathan Taylor fits that. James Cook fits that. Devon Achane fits that. Now, honestly, Javonte Williams fits that. He is the guy in Dallas, and he needs. I was off on him in best ball. I just didn't think he had it, but I still don't think he's a great running back, but he's just in a good situation. He's getting volume, so he's a guy that we need to mix in every week. Christian McCaffrey, obviously, we know is going to get a lot of volume. I won't be playing him next week unless it's in stacks because he's at 85, going to be at 8,500 this week. But our top guys are all guys that make sense because you knew they were all going to get 20 plus touches. That's what our player pool needs to be. Kenneth Walker is a bit of an outlier because after week 1, we didn't know if he was going to get all the touches. Moving forward, we can expect that it looks like he's going to get 10 to 15 carries a week. And it is a split backfield in Seattle. If he continues to ball out like he did this past week, maybe that changes. So we'll keep an eye on that one. Ramondre was more of a split. I was really heavy on Henderson this week. That was another one of my big misses. He was one of my core plays. I was right there in the right backfield, just picked the wrong one. Ramondre bounced back with a big week this past week. Jamar, though, fits that. Chuba fits that. Saquon fits that. But Saquon was too expensive for us to play. Even though Saquon was top 10, he was an awful play at 8,000. So it's important to have an understanding of what is a successful week compared to their salary. For the high-end guys to hit, they have to hit so hard for it to make sense. That's why I primarily do not play the super high-end guys unless they're correlated to one of my offensive bets. It's very important. That's one of the keys to building successful lineups week in and week out. The guys that are the most important, the ones that you have to have, tend to be in this lower end range. The guys that have that outlier week that are cheaper, the Odunzes, the Wandales, even our quarterbacks that played out this week. At running back, it's more about that middle ground where you're going to get volume. We generally don't want to go cheap at running back. We want to go medium value with a lot of volume. And at tight end, we primarily want to punt. Let's look over here at defense. So the Ravens, they were pretty low owned. It was just hard to build lineups at that 3,700, so I was pretty much out on them. At Seahawks, I do want to see what the Seahawks' defensive stats look like going into the week. Let's see here. Where is Seattle on here? So let's look at their grades. Yeah, so they actually, on the grades, didn't jump out at all. So they would have been a tough one to pick. I did think that the Pittsburgh week was an outlier week, so I did have them in a few lineups. It's also skewed to defense can be skewed by like one lucky break here and there quite a bit. And it wasn't like there weren't any scores here that you had to have to compete. I think pretty sure the winner in the Millie Maker had the Cardinals. Let's go look at the Millie Maker winning lineup. he had the 49ers. So yeah, he missed. He spent up at defense and he missed hard with only a 5 spot. So very interesting to see that. We were on a lot of this. I didn't have any Wandale. That was my big miss on the week. But yeah, I mean, we had this core. We had McCaffrey. Didn't have enough Taylor, but I had a decent amount of him. So we were right there. We were right there. We had it was a very fun overtime in the Dallas Giants game. At that time I was up to 11th place when they first went into overtime, and we were really rooting for Ferguson or Pickens, big TD. It was fun. Haven't been that close in a while. It was fun to be that close to the millie and have a legit shot at it. Overtime didn't play. They went from being that crazy shootout to 4 straight punts in OT, which is a bit of a bummer. Did get some more points in OT that helped me score more points that moved me up in the final rankings. But you can see if I would have gone Javonte, I was down here at 229 Forever Wildcat 4. Wish I could change that. Wish DraftKings would let me change that to Millie Maker. That's my old high school name. But anyways, if I would have had put in Javonte and JMO, that would have given me 10 more points. That would have jumped me up into second place. So we were close. Didn't quite have the right combination. I was a ways off from obviously getting here. The big miss on getting to the 260 was Wandale. I just didn't have any pieces of Wandale. I was very locked in my Cowboy bring backs. It was Malik and Malik only. So moving forward, we'll look and evaluate that. One other thing too is I look at the week. Like there was one bring back in both of these games, and actually in the Giants game, I was really heavy on the Cowboys side, but the side you needed to be on was the Giants side, and the main comeback that you needed, actually the top 2 comebacks that you needed in that game was Ferguson and Javonte Williams. So that would have been the perfect play on that. So it would have been quarterback, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 for the Giants, and then tight end and running back 1 for the opponent. So I'm always looking at those combinations, kind of just not thinking about the names, not thinking about it being Javonte or Jake Ferguson, just thinking about who are the guys on the offense that are likely to get touches and what are different combinations that could occur. So we just missed on that combo, and then we hit on the right combo with our Lions stack. So this game he has, he had the skinny stack here with the exact stack he needed out of the Lions and Bears game. And then he had obviously the big stack between the Giants and Cowboys here. And then at running back, which I like doing, where your running backs can just be completely uncorrelated if you're not having them as part of your offensive run, which is what he did here. He had the chalk and McCaffrey, but then he had low-owned Jonathan Taylor, who is somebody that I should have been on more. He's just a guy that can have these boom games regardless of matchup. You want to have him mixed into your player pool every week. So interesting breakdown there of the Millie Maker. We were close. It was a fun week. All right, my friends. Well, I appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully next week we'll be celebrating the Millie, but it was a solid week for the Millie Maker Maniac. Nice to see that 17K number up there in the balance. Tell your friends, smash that subscribe button. Let's build some lineups next week that are going to take down that Millie Maker. All right, my friends. Have a good week.